So for those you're not familiar with me, I can go by a few different titles. I do some different things with drugs. Behavioral pharmacologist, psychopharmacologist, substance abuse researcher, experimental psychologist. Kind of two sides of what I do. One, I administer drugs to humans in the laboratory. I've been conducting and publishing drug research for about 18 years now. And no, I didn't go to college when I was 10. I look a little bit younger than I am, but I've been doing this stuff for quite some time, and do research and administer drugs such as methamphetamine, cocaine, sedative hypnotics like benzodiazepines, nicotine and other tobacco and other forms of nicotine, a wide variety of substances, including psychedelics. For the last 11 years, it's been great to work with Roland Griffiths and the rest of the team at Johns Hopkins, so administering a lot of doses of psilocybin, and then other really interesting compounds. We did the first in humans formal work with salvinorin A from Salvia divinorum, high doses of dextromethorphan, so a lot of the psychedelic stuff. And then the other side of what I do is addictions research, trying to understand the psychology of addiction. Most of my funding from the US government relates to behavioral economics of decision making that underlies addictive disorders. It's kind of a thing that's in common no matter what drug you're talking about. What are the commonalities across addiction and the decisions people make? And I've conducted looked at several modalities of treatment, including cocaine immunization, using a learning enhancer like decycloserine to facilitate cocaine addiction, contingency management, which is a systematic use of incentives. So all that to say is what I'm going to show you combines these two areas, these two hats I wear, using drug administration, specifically psilocybin, to treat drug addiction, specifically in what we've done so far, tobacco smoking. And out of all that stuff I've told you in my time in the field, I just can't emphasize enough how I think the use of classic psychedelics to treat addictive disorders, and I'm not even limiting addiction to drug addiction, but the use of psychedelics to treat addictive disorders is, I think, the most promising thing. There's so much mortality, there's so much suffering that goes on with people who struggle with addictive disorders that I think we need to go full on and study every treatment modality that looks reasonably safe and effective. And I think this is the most promising. This and other work using these classic psychedelics for addiction is the most, not some of it, but the most promising stuff out there. And so I hope I'll convince some of you that of that too, given some data I'll show you. All right, so just in case I run out of time, I don't want to shortchange the acknowledgement. So initial funding for this idea of using psilocybin for smoking cessation treatment came from the Beckley Foundation. So they really took a leap of faith with us. There was no data on using psilocybin for this indication. So they really took a leap of faith, and we had this hunch that this would work, and it's turned out to look promising. And then the Hefter Research Institute has stepped in and donated significant resources to finishing this project, and most recently moving forward into a larger controlled randomized trial. I'll tell you just a bit about that, which we've only recently started. And I'd like to thank the entire team that's contributed, and this is just to the smoking cessation work. So we've got a large and growing team, but particularly want to thank of course, Roland, Al Garcia, Mary Casamano, and Tassine Nourani. So Roland and Tassine are, it's lucky to have both of them here, actually at Breaking Convention. So thanks to all of these folks. And oh yeah, our drug supply guy, Dave Nichols, who I think just went to the bathroom, so I had to call him out. Okay, so why in the world would you use a classic psychedelics or a serotonin 2A receptor agonist to treat addiction? I'll review this, but first let me just, there's not enough audience participation, so pop quiz hotshot. What am I showing you up here? See, I go to like some mainstream drug dependence. They don't know meeting. They don't, you guys are like millisecond. Okay, upper right. See, that's just me like the tough one there. Down here. Over here, that's an old Delicide ampule of, Sandow's LSD. And then, of course, the exact species. Very good. So one thing I wanted to say, before getting into the rationale why we want to use this class of drugs to treat addictive disorders, is just to address something that comes up for a lot of folks. Probably not news to a lot of you folks here, but folks say, oh, you're just substituting one drug for another. Well, that's not true for a number of reasons. One, we're not administering this on a daily basis to substitute for the drug. This is facilitated psychotherapy. But also, across every level of analysis that's available to us scientifically, we know these aren't drugs of addiction. They meet psychiatric criteria for potentially being drugs of abuse depending on the way they're used. So you take a big dose of mushrooms and you drive across town in your car, that's abuse. Right? I hope most folks, I hope everyone would agree with that. In the definition of abuse being endangering oneself, causing harm to oneself or others. But they're not drugs of addiction. So we have very good animal models of operant conditioning where animals will self-administer the drugs that are addictive in humans. Doesn't happen with these guys. In fact, it's more likely they'll treat these as punishers and avoid these types of drugs. We know in terms of the way these drugs work in the so-called reward systems in the brain, the mesolimbic structures. These drugs don't increase dopamine in the shell of the nucleus accumbens, these mechanisms that are very reliably tied to what's addictive in people. And we know from the epidemiology, so the big population surveys, that people don't become addicted to these drugs. So that is not a concern. So no one's going to get hooked on psilocybin, but why do we think it would work? So there's three main big categories of evidence, I would say, suggestive evidence. One is this anthropological literature on ceremonial classic hallucinogen or psychedelic use being associated with addiction recovery. So this is both in terms of peyote use within the Native American church, a number of older reports documenting stories of recovery there, primarily with alcoholism, but then also ayahuasca ceremonies in Amazonian societies and syncretic religions that have developed from there. But one of the big caveats, of course, this is all correlational and observational, and we do know that religious involvement in general is associated with decreased addiction problems. So that's something to keep in mind, even though the findings are suggestive and people make strong claims about the causal role of the peyote and ayahuasca use. Well, the second category suggestive that there's efficacy is early research from the 1950s to 70s. So tested in humans, primarily LSD for the treatment of alcoholism. And while some studies prepared patients and utilized supportive conditions, others administered really high doses, like 800 micrograms of LSD, to unprepared, physically restrained patients. And so you had this variability across studies. So here was one of the older studies which had a Mac Daddy setup like some of our researchers have shown you today. You wouldn't mind spending the day in a type of room like this. But other studies, they'd strap someone down to a bed like this. So there were variation in results. Okay, not a surprise to us. Now, but until pretty recently, reviews of this literature had found, well, there's some evidence for, some evidence against, kind of a mixed bag. And then I have to explain this. I was kind of hoping Terry would do that. This is her study with Paul Johansson. But now I have to do the heavy lifting and explain it. But correct me if I describe anything wrong. So they really brought a lot of clarity to this older literature by taking only the randomized controlled trials, 6 of them, and running them through this process called meta-analysis, which is a way to get different studies that used varying techniques, had different outcome measures, and get them to talk the same statistical language. And what I'm showing you here from their paper is the odds ratio of the LSD group in whatever study doing better on this side versus the control condition, the control group on this side. So again, this side means that LSD had better results. And the individual studies are in these symbols here, and then this big one is the aggregate. And so What they found very clearly in aggregate, that across studies, LSD nearly doubled the odds that alcoholic patients would be improved at the first follow-up. Those are the data I'm showing you here. And it's not just that it meets significance, this is a big effect. This is like we don't see, even today, in drug dependence treatments. We should have been following up on this 30 years ago, and we're only now, able to do so. And then the third category of suggestive findings, I would say some findings that from our laboratory for the last 15 years in our investigation of high-dose psilocybin effects in largely healthy, normal individuals, that is people coming in not for a therapeutic application, but so we've seen evidence of, and if you want to see more about this, certainly go to Roland's talk tomorrow. I mean, definitely go to Roland's talk tomorrow. We see evidence of long-term behavior change, not only from participants under double-blind procedures, but from community observers. So people like spouses, co-workers, friends. So not only was the individual in the study blinded in terms of what drug, whether there's psilocybin or a placebo or comparator condition, but their friends certainly didn't know. These people were reporting, yeah, my friend's been more easygoing, less stressed out. A lot of behavioral reports that we've systematically collected. So quite remarkable. I'm a big fan, and a huge interest of mine is understanding the primary mystical experience as a construct. However, at my heart, the first lens I run everything through is a behavioral psychology lens. I'm a behaviorist. And so despite all of the reports about how amazing an experience is, when you show me a real behavior change, particularly with an intractable series of behaviors like addiction, you need to know you're really onto something real. So we've seen this evidence of behavior change, long-term mood elevating effects. We certainly know that stress and mood are highly tied to addiction recovery and relapse. So addiction involves behavior, it involves mood. So we've seen all these effects in healthy, non-addicted individuals. And finally, these salient, which I mentioned, salient mystical type effects with sustained personal meaning. And so even though we don't study it much in research, if you ask a lot of people how they've recovered from different substances out there in the real world, a lot of people will talk about spiritual, sometimes from a religious lens, sometimes not, more of a broader spiritual framework. These type of experiences or insights, going along and prompting them to recover from addiction. Of course, the classic example, most well known, is Bill Wilson, founder of AA, who had a mystical experience and inspired his own recovery and the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous and the whole 12-step movement. And then a finding we published a few years ago in Healthy Normals is increased personality openness. To our knowledge, this is still the first demonstration of a relatively discrete laboratory event actually changing a personality dimension as assessed by an extremely well-validated personality instrument. And openness is supposed to tap this dimension of a broad appreciation for aesthetics, an open-minded attitude towards beliefs that you don't share. We believe generally that openness is key to addiction recovery. And one has to be open to change. Part of addiction, if you told yourself countless times after failing, I can't do this, I'm not the type, I'm just a smoker, I'm going to be an alcoholic. One has to be open to step outside of that they're more than that. So we think this is relevant as well. So let's see, did I miss a point there? No, that was it. Okay, so despite those older findings and that were summarized in Terry's meta-analysis, then there were the dark ages, which she spoke about. Despite these early suggestive findings, follow-up with rigorous studies utilizing high levels of patient preparation and support were not conducted, and human research with classic hallucinogens or psychedelics in the US became dormant soon after, for decades. And the important point is that the dormancy wasn't due to specific medical concerns. It was due to the sensationalism surrounding recreational use and these larger, societal concerns. So, as a science, like, we really dropped the ball. It's really unprecedented in the history of science, certainly clinical science, for something to be on deep freeze for those many years, something that looks so promising. So, okay, we started this feasibility study. We wanted to get into this addiction treatment realm after, some years of studying psilocybin in normal non-therapeutic research volunteers. And we decided to go with cigarette smoking as a model. One reason, because I had done a lot of previous work in cigarette smokers and cigarette addiction. But also, the older studies include not only alcohol, but also opioid addiction. And so this suggests a general anti-addiction efficacy. Most medications are for this drug or for that drug, and they act in a relatively specific way at, say, the receptor that mediates those drug effects. But what this earlier literature was kind of suggesting, that this sort of hit higher order psychological constructs that were in common across addictions, no matter what drug you're talking about. Another reason, so we thought, okay, so if it works for addiction, it should work for smoking addiction. We also went with it because compared to some drugs, including heavy alcoholism and cocaine and opioid addiction, there's a relatively lack of social impairment. No one's ruined their career or gone into bankruptcy, or their spouse has left them, typically with smoking. So we thought, that's some baggage in our small pilot study we wouldn't have to deal with. And in fact, there have been some anecdotal reports of quitting after psilocybin or LSD, including, if you've read the book about the Leo Zeff, the Myron Stolaroff interview with him, The Secret Chief, or The Secret Chief Revealed, Leo Zeff reported quitting smoking back in the 60s during an LSD session and never smoked since. He also reported overcoming problems with overuse of Vicodin for headaches. Okay, so as I touched on a little bit earlier, we don't believe if this works, it's because of the direct effect on nicotine receptors in the brain. We think this more general effect. And this is important because a lot of times when we presented this work early on, folks said, hold on, something doesn't smell right. They'd say, because I use one of these things, I take mushrooms, that they would say, and I love smoking. I love smoking. So, and how many of you, how many of you know friends that love smoking when they've taken acid or mushrooms? Don't be bashful. This is your friend, remember. This is not you. This is a friend. So, so we're not denying that at all. In fact, this cat right here, this is one of these cats that loves smoking. I mean, look at the pupils on this guy. So a lot of cats love smoking when they've taken one of these classic psychedelic compounds. So we're not arguing that at all. Again, we think we're hitting, so if one doesn't have the intention, it's far less likely to be therapeutically applicable, and someone could very much enjoy that cigarette under the effects. So besides everything that I've shown you, the fact that it's a good model system of addiction, it's also a really important, drug to be concerned about. And what I'm showing you here are drug-related deaths in the thousands. So when I go up to 500 here, that's 500,000 deaths per year, and this is in the United States. This is in the United States alone. So 500,000 drug-related deaths from tobacco per year. Look at alcohol, it's a quarter of that. All prescription, all illicit drugs combined, all the opioids, all of the cocaine, all of the methamphetamine, right there. And then over-the-counter analgesics up there. So the mortality is staggering when you're looking at the problems of drug addiction. And then, personally, I wouldn't be too concerned if folks, someone enjoys smoking and they know the risk. I'm not concerned in, getting them to quit. But the fact is, over 2/3 of smokers, at least in the U.S., want to quit completely. And the most effective medications fail to help the vast majority of folks remain smoke-free for a year. So worldwide, we're talking about 5 million deaths. Again, the problem is staggering. So I could quote esteemed, World Health experts such as the Surgeon General in the US during the 80s, C. Everett Koop, who did so much to bring attention to smoking and reduce smoking rates. I could cite folks like this, but I'd like to cite my favorite public health official, perhaps, from Colorado, Mr. Mackey. Does someone know this guy? And he tells us that smoking is bad, okay? Just don't do it. Come on, kids, just don't smoke, okay? So smoking is bad. We know that, Spend a lot of time telling you smoking's bad for you. So here we're on to our pilot study. We got 15 people. Important points here, these were real smokers. They're about 51 years old on average, about over 30 years smoking on average. And when they came in, they were smoking almost a pack a day. These were no lightweights. These were real smokers. And I'll say this, for this study and all of our other studies we've conducted at Hopkins, and this is actually true for the other research going on across the world with psilocybin, the study has followed the safety guidelines that we published several years ago. So it's screened. I don't have time to get into all of this, but take safety extremely seriously, involves screening, proper monitoring, and proper integration and follow-up of individuals. Okay, so quickly to go through the kind of boring timeline, 2 screening visits, 4 2-hour prep visits with staff in which we prepare them for psilocybin, but we also go over cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, which is our psychosocial treatment backdrop. And this is stuff like keeping a smoking diary and techniques for dealing with if you do slip and have a cigarette, how to appropriately follow up with that and so that it doesn't continue a pattern. And then we had our first psilocybin session on the target quit date that's assigned a few weeks ahead of time. We started out with a moderately high dose, but moderate might not be a great word because this is 20 milligrams body weight adjusted, it's pretty high. We had this introspective framework, the psychedelic therapy model with the eye shades and music. The instructions are to trust, let go, and be open. There wasn't a specific coaching about smoking during the session. It's like most of our stuff. We sit back, we shut up, we're there for safety during the session. If they're having trouble, we'll hold their hand, work with them. But it's mainly a non-guided experience, if you will. We always follow up the next day for an hour or two discussion with them. We had weekly non-psilocybin meetings with them to reinforce those CBT techniques for the next 10 weeks. And then sprinkled into those 10 weeks, we have a second and third psilocybin session, and the default, which most people experience, was to go up to 30 milligrams, and that's the real high dose. We've done a lot of work with that high dose. Again, it's all body weight adjusted, the dose is. Okay, so here's the important piece here, our results. So when I'm showing you this, we did 2 biological verifications. These are very valid biological metrics of recent smoking. What I'm showing you is every visit across their study on the x-axis. And this, I'm showing you carbon monoxide. You breathe into a little machine and tells you whether you've been smoking or not. This is the clinical cutoff. And this is the psilocybin session here. And that was that's when they came in before the psilocybin session, and bam. This is what you learn in grad school. This is one of those data sets they tell you don't need statistics. They tell you something's working here. Okay, so that's carbon monoxide. What about urinary cotinine? They kind of have complementary time courses in terms of these different metabolites. Same exact story there. And so what that meant at the individual level is at the 6 months follow-up, 12 out of the 15, or 80%, were abstinent. And if you're not in the addiction field, I just need to highlight for you how crazy that sounds to folks that treat smoking. I don't want you to put too much stock into this because I'm comparing results across studies with very different techniques and different methods, but just to give you some general idea why we're so excited about this. I'm comparing different treatment modalities, nicotine replacement, cognitive behavioral therapy by itself, bupropion, which is Zyban, varenicline or Chantix, which is the most efficacious drug approved in the US. And these are our results. We're really excited about this. We think we're onto something new and working through an entirely novel mechanism compared to these other things. And so we've gone out, that's 6 months, we've gone out to 12 months. I think there was one more person in that data set who was still smoking at that point. And we recently completed a follow-up at an average of 30 months. In fact, they were at different times since they had come in, but on average, it was 30 months. But again, that's, I think, still at 60%. That's unheard of for that absolute success rate at that time. So that's why we're so excited. We can't claim from this design that it's definitely that's caused by psilocybin. But with the results this good, we have a suspicion that psilocybin is doing something. In terms of why people said it helped, they said change their orientation towards the future, change their priorities, strengthen their belief in the ability to quit. I'm going to go a little quicker here. 87% rated at least one of their sessions among the 10 most meaningful experiences of their lives. I doubt if you could say that about a lot of addiction recovery. I think that and I think that's really a reason why it helps. It's a big step in your life and it needs to stick. Correlation with the mystical experience. Our lab's data tells us over and over and over again, it's not just getting psilocybin, it's the nature of the experience that unfolds. So those who had stronger mystical experiences were more likely to show reduced smoking and reduced craving long term. Okay, very briefly, we conducted a survey with over 1,100 people about asked people, have you quit smoking because of a psychedelic? And a lot of people came in and said absolutely they did. And over 161 reported total absence for at least 6 months. And some people, they said it was 2 weeks ago they had mushrooms and quit. So included in this set are a lot of people that had quit for a long time. So that's really exciting. And something the data is telling us from that survey is that we said, compare this quit attempt with your psychedelic with other times where you tried to quit smoking. One of the things that really pops out is all of the affective, the mood, the stress, anxiety related aspects were shown to be they report them to be much easier with the psychedelic. And all of the somatic symptoms were very similar. I think I'm being buzzed. Okay, really quickly, Michael Bogenschutz found extremely similar results recently with psilocybin for alcoholism. And he's moved on to a controlled clinical trial and found it was related to the strength of the psilocybin experience. I'd like to claim that this was one of our volunteers, but it wasn't. I kind of missed my setup line there. I'm in a rush, but this wasn't. But one of our, if you can read really quickly, that's not time. I'm past time. So can't claim that it's causally psilocybin, but it tells us it's really promising. And we have moved on to a controlled clinical trial with 80 people randomized to psilocybin treatment or nicotine patch. We're doing fMRI imaging before and throughout the treatment process, not on the session day, but afterwards. Is there something to this afterglow that has been described in the literature for decades, but we really don't have a handle on it scientifically? So we're really excited to move forward with that. And again, I'd like to thank the most wonderful colleagues that have worked on this project at Johns Hopkins, especially Roland. So thank you very much.